Our point is not that we disagree with Sam Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape, that human flourishing is a good thing. We do agree with that.
That's good? But the fact that it needed to be said is kind of unsettling.
What we don't agree with is the foundation for that.
What foundation? You should want good things instead of bad things to happen to people just because you value their experience. No further foundation required. So I guess that was a cold open preview for a video that runs under 4 minutes, but whatever. It works for me because now that I've replied to it, I have an opening hook too, and I'm not great at starting my videos with those. Now I guess since he did his title sequence, I'll do mine. Which totally rules over his, and we obviously don't need a philosophical foundation to establish that.
I'm assuming you have read Harris's Moral Landscape all the way through?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I did too, and I want you to know, like, I'm on your side. I believe, like, God definitely authors morality, but I think in Stealing from God, I think you may have, like, slightly neglected Harris's argument.
I want to quickly acknowledge something here. It's easy to get caught up in the prepackaged presentations of professional, how can I politely say this, charlatans like Frank Turek, and see them as a monolithic representation of how Christians view arguments for and against their faith. But the dynamic is more complicated than that. Those presentations land on the ears of Christians who see their faith in different ways, consider arguments with varying degrees of openness, and in some cases try to make sense of and absorb things they hear from the world. As rigid and self-reinforcing as the field of apologetics itself is, it isn't always a neat box that a Christian chooses to settle into as much as a horrible weight they find themselves dragging until they can, hopefully someday, break the chain that attaches them to it. So let's be careful not to lump those Christians in with the people who prey on them. Keep that in mind while watching this young man, who I think goes by the name of Jack. While a believer probably looking to reinforce his belief, and while quickly assuring Frank, "I'm on your side," he seems to have some genuine interest in understanding Harris's point and openly confronting any inaccuracies in Turek's response. Honestly, this could have been me some 20-odd years ago. Whatever the case, the questions he asks and the way Frank responds says a lot. Also, I find it fascinating to pause and look over individual members of this crowd. Who are they? What brought them here? Are some atheists? How many are just cheerleading apologists? And how many are just asking questions? I don't know. I guess it's not that relevant, but I find it interesting.
Okay, go ahead.
I think Sam makes a... I had to write this down. I think Sam made a pretty good point about pain being correlated to well-being. And, like, again, I believe God authors morality, but I think we shouldn't brush over the idea that Sam does establish kind of a baseline for morality and well-being. I think the metaphor he put was, if you can imagine a world where everyone experienced the most pain possible, we can at least all objectively agree that anything else but that would be better.
So literally anything is morally preferable to what Christians think God is going to subject non-believers to for eternity. I agree that's a good, almost mathematically verifiable baseline for morality.
And because he has a baseline, even though it may get foggier down the road with where an atheistical sense of morality could be, even though it does get foggy, I think he does establish a paradigm there, and there's a plane, especially since he did have that baseline.
Bless his heart, he calls it an atheistical sense of morality, which, yes, the wording itself is funny, but there's an even more basic issue with any version of this phrase. Not believing in God doesn't assign you to any category of morality. It just means God doesn't factor into how you conceptualize morality, and an atheist can do so in any number of ways for any number of reasons. When you stop believing in God, you don't step into any particular box. You just step out of one. But Christians are so immersed in the idea of God defining morality that not believing in Him looks like a system in and of itself. I do like what he said about how, to an atheist, there can be some baseline moral facts that we should all be able to agree on, but that things can get foggy, as it really gets down to the nature of the problem. But this has nothing to do with atheism and is just a fundamental fact of how morality works for everybody. Atheist, Christian, or whoever else, most of us can agree that suffering is bad. There's not much ambiguity about that, especially in extreme examples. However, once we try to apply this to real life, we quickly start running into complex dilemmas that all of us, and yes, that includes atheists, Christians, and whoever else, have trouble coming up with easy answers for. That's where morality seems foggy, and the best thing we can do is try to peer into and carefully navigate that fog. You know, try to understand the actual complexities of the situation and reach the best outcome. When you just pretend the fog's not there, say, for example, by letting yourself be convinced that you have a clear answer from God, there's a chance that you'll just confidently sail full speed into it. And if anything good ever comes from that, it's only through luck.
For the question, basically, I want you to expound more than you did in stealing from God, like, at least you can, like, in this amount of time.
I wonder if maybe we didn't explain ourselves clearly in there, Jack.
Notice how Frank immediately jumps in and characterizes this situation. There's no real issue to be addressed. Harris didn't present anything that challenges or even gives Christians reason to re-examine, we might even say cross-examine, their view of morality. It's just that we didn't explain ourselves clearly in there, Jack. Now, maybe this royal we is Frank's way of saying he didn't make his point well in stealing from God, but it sounds a lot more like a patronizing dismissal of how this Jack presented his objection. Either way, it's telling how quickly Frank circles the wagons at the first sign of a disruptive sounding question. While Jack seems to be dragging apologetics along with him as he searches for answers, he's still wandering outside the little prepackaged box, which is something Frank quickly needs to correct. Now yes, this is an on-the-spot answer in a time-sensitive format, but the fact that Frank so quickly jumps to we didn't explain ourselves clearly with no hint of that's a good question or this could be a complicated issue is telling.
Because our point is not that we disagree with Sam Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape, that human flourishing is a good thing. We do agree with that. What we don't agree with is the foundation for that.
I alluded to this the first time when Frank was as artificially black and white as his simplified answers to everything, but this is extremely problematic. As a practical matter, if you need a further foundation to why suffering is bad and flourishing is good, then there's probably something wrong with you. And as a matter of logic, any moral framework will be based on something we value for its own sake. And once you hit that axiomatic value, there's no way to explain yourself further. This is true for theistic as well as non-theistic concepts of morality. If a Christian sees obeying God as their foundation for morality, they'll have to accept that as axiomatic because there really is no logical reason why obeying God is good in and of itself. If a Christian does start giving reasons why we should obey him, for example, he knows what's good for us or whatever, then obedience to God is no longer the basis for morality, but rather a tool to help us live better lives. So it's equally valid for atheists to take it as axiomatic that flourishing and avoiding harm are good for their own sake. It's generally agreed upon across society anyway, except by sociopaths and pedantic apologists.
Because if there is no God, then why human flourishing? Why not dolphin flourishing?
Yeah, I think what Sam is...
Or cowboy flourishing.
I think
These dumb questions aren't the gotcha apologists think they are. Instead, they just help illuminate why we value flourishing and challenge the boundaries we place on who should flourish and who shouldn't. Because why not dolphin flourishing? Human flourishing is the baseline we can most instinctively comprehend, but once we think about why we value it, we should find our empathy extending to other sentient creatures. And this isn't just some theoretical thought experiment or hippy-dippy animal rights thing. I mean, I'm pretty sure Frank would be furious if he saw his neighbor beating his dog or dissecting live squirrels in his backyard, right? At least I'd hope he would. That's because we do have a moral sense related to animal flourishing. It's just more accessible to us when we see something bad happening to a species who can vividly communicate their distress to humans. As for why not cowboy flourishing... Jesus Christ. I guess he means why shouldn't we only be concerned about the flourishing of cowboys, which makes this a simple question about tribalism. True, our first instinct is to mainly value those within our tribe and dehumanize outsiders. But the more we learn about others, the more we recognize our sense of humanity should extend to them. This is really basic stuff, and the fact that Turek acts like these kinds of freshman-level ethics questions are so baffling that they undermine secular morality shows me he doesn't deserve to be or probably intend to be a serious part of the conversation. If it helps, we can clarify we're talking about the flourishing of sentient beings in general and not just of humans. But I question how far that will get with someone who thinks they dunked on you with, "What about dolphin or cowboy flourishing?"
I think what Sam is mostly establishing is like, I think there's definitely like a metaphysical aspect to it, but when you get down to more or less like, especially like neurons and like the way the human body feels pain, I think he does have like somewhat of a case that at least physical pain on that paradigm holds weight for something of an objective morality. Again, like
but why is it wrong to inflict pain on people, according to him?
I think because when you...
What if you get enjoyment from it?
All right, so this dumb question again. Most of us can weigh the negative experience of a person being subjected to pain against whatever pleasure a person gets by causing it, and pretty easily determine that something bad is happening in the situation. Aside from the fact that the distress of the victim outweighs whatever perverse pleasure is being gained by the perpetrator is actively intruding upon the victim's experience to cause it. This is incredibly simple stuff, and it's embarrassing to see apologists pretend it isn't. Besides, this is a total non-argument because you can easily flip the script and ask a Christian, why is it wrong to sin? What if you get enjoyment from it? If there's no objective reason that sparing people pain is more important than a person's enjoyment, then there's no objective reason that avoiding sin is more important than a person's enjoyment. This is just a classic case of being overly pedantic about a problem but thinking it disappears if you kick it up to God.
Well, I think like that's a question that, I mean, I've heard your response to this question a couple times, but I think that's definitely sort of how we would say the moral law is written on our heart. And again, I would concur with that. I think even from a secular standpoint, there's a base given knowledge that physical pain...
Hang on, Jack.
I kind of feel for Jack here. He has the problem a lot of us have, which is that he recognizes and deeply viscerally feels the importance of humanitarian values as a baseline for morality, but he has a hard time getting his head around why well enough to justify it. And that's a hard thing for any of us to put into words. Now yes, he puts it in terms of God's moral laws being written on our heart, which is a totally arbitrary way of interpreting our sense of how we should treat each other, but I think we should give allowance for the fact that this is how he's been trained to view it, and it seems like he's making some kind of honest attempt to expand his understanding of what it is and what it has to do with morality. But how will Frank respond? I doubt I'll be spoiling much if I reveal that he'll take advantage of the fact that Jack's momentarily at a loss for words and steamroll him. So I guess let's watch that happen.
Hang on, Jack, because we got a long line behind you.
Yeah, I understand.
I see what you're saying. This is not an epistemological problem. It's an ontological problem. It's not how we know what good and bad behavior is. It's how do you define what good and bad behavior is in the absence of God? How do you discover what good is?
Given the presence of God, how do you discover what good is? Are we going to consider that question? No? Well, that's weird, because with or without God, we're in pretty much identical situations when it comes to conceptualizing morality. In either case, we need to assess who else exists, how our actions impact them, and how we should behave as a result. Would we behave differently toward God than toward humans? Maybe. But that would just be because God needs or wants different things from us and might respond differently to us. Would God have more power to coerce us into the behavior he wants, thus establishing a different level of authority? Probably. But this just introduces a different dynamic of force. Would God know more about the consequences of our actions and thus be able to give us more precise moral instructions? Given he's all-knowing, sure. But this just introduces more knowledge to help us navigate the same process. None of these factors change what morality is. In the absence of God, we need to make the foundational value judgment that everybody should be treated well, and in the presence of God, we need to make the foundational value judgment that God should be obeyed. So don't ask this question as if defining good is a puzzler for atheists, yet has a clearer, more logically defensible answer for Christians.
Remember, if there's no purpose to the game, you can't say that, oh, this play is a better play than this other play. This behavior is a better behavior than another behavior if there's no purpose to life.
Understood.
And there is no purpose to life on on Harris's atheistic materialistic worldview.
I concur. Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
All right, thanks, Jack.
Now, I know it's tempting at this point to be blinded by the spectacular insulting stupidity of Frank just saying there's no purpose on our worldview. On our worldview? Okay. Even Google Docs wants me to fix that, but whatever. And to shout back, hey, don't just assume we have no purpose just because we don't believe in your God. So let's get it out of our system real quick. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Hey, don't just assume we have no purpose just because we don't believe in your God. Feel better? Good. But there's more to it than that, because Frank goes beyond the typical, how can you have a purpose without God retort, and poses a more immediate and concrete question, that being, what is the purpose of morality? This does two things. First, it gives us a question that's easier to answer than the purposely obfuscating nonsense about what kind of broad cosmic purpose we'd have without God. And second, it helps illustrate what's wrong with how Frank's approaching morality. In answer to the question, I'd say the purpose of morality is to help promote the flourishing of conscious beings and avoid harming them. So in spite of what Frank says, some plays can be better than other plays depending on whether they help meet this goal. This isn't that hard to comprehend. Now sure, we don't have eternal souls on atheism, so atheists can claim it's all for nothing since we die in the end. But this still presents us with a choice. Given this state of affairs, would we rather people be happy and healthy during the time they're alive or not? I'd rather they were. And I really doubt Frank is actually so ambivalent about the well-being of non-eternal people that he wouldn't want the same. I mean, what if he saw his next-door neighbor beating his child? Would he really do nothing because who cares if a kid grows up getting smacked around if he's eventually just going to die? If so, if Frank actually internalizes the idea as he tries to sneak past his audience in the form of abstractions, then there's something seriously wrong with him. But the core point is that the promotion of well-being is a reasonable end goal for morality. In fact, I'd go so far as to claim that it's the true end goal of morality almost by definition for nearly everybody. This includes Christians. To show why, let's erase my answer to the question of what's the purpose of morality and replace it with an alternative such as to please God, to obey God, to align with His character, to meet His standard or whatever. Different Christians might phrase it in different ways, but the point is we're replacing my answer with something about God, assuming He's somehow at the foundation of morality. And this poses a telling question. If Christians propose one of these things as the goal of morality, and I think well-being is the goal of morality, then what happens if these two goals conflict? For example, what if God commanded you to harm other people because He enjoyed suffering? Would aligning with His nature and obeying Him be moral? I doubt you'd say so, and the very idea probably offends every gut-level feeling you have about what morality is supposed to be, so much so that you might want to reply, God would never command such a thing. But that answer doesn't resolve the problem. It just proves my point by showing me that well-being is so foundational to your concept of morality that you need God's nature to align with it and His commands to support it. God is not the end goal of morality. Even in the Christian narrative, His commands are a tool that serves the end goal of promoting well-being. Deep down we all know this, which is why Christians are very comfortable with God's commands when they serve this goal well, and start nervously cooking up justifications when they don't.
By the way, Jack, that's good you brought that up because that is the biggest, I think, disconnect that atheists have on the moral argument. They always confuse epistemology and ontology. Epistemology is how you know something. Ontology is the study of the thing you know. Why does that thing exist to begin with? And I think that's what they always forget. All right, thank you. Appreciate it, Jack.
So basically, Frank heard a question that pushed the limits of the scripted routine he does about morality, so he had to rush to shove things back into the neat little box where nobody has to think any open-ended thoughts or ask any open-ended questions. And a key part of this was to attribute any inconvenient boat-rocking questions about his script to the fact that atheists misunderstood something. Of course, the fact we don't agree morality comes from an invisible supernatural spirit being Frank can't show us doesn't mean we confuse epistemology with ontology. We just have different, more nuanced, and on the face of it apparently more intelligent ideas about what abstractions are and where they come from. But that's a dangerous idea for Frank to confront, so he cuts off the train of thought by saying we've just made a basic, easily identifiable error. And that isn't helpful for anything other than controlling your narrative. I'm not sure what this Jack fella is really like or what journey his line of questioning might be taking him on, but I hope he doesn't let Frank discourage him from continuing with it. If by chance you ever see this, Jack, I hope you know I understand you being thrown off your game when you're on the spot with an experienced apologist. They're good at what they do, and it can be hard to get a word in edgewise. But I hope after you've had some time to breathe and reflect on this interaction, you'll see how quick Frank was to shut down your questions and get you back on script. While you might agree with him in a lot of ways, please recognize that this reaction to your question was not helpful, and it does not encourage you to engage in healthy thinking. Don't let Frank train you to curl up like a hedgehog at the sight of uncomfortable questions. Spend some quality time with those questions. Give them real thought instead of rushing to assign them pat answers and shut them away. Let them lead you places outside the neat little box you were probably taught to stay in, and as they introduce new questions, new shades of meaning, look directly at them and give yourself time to absorb them. And even if you eventually come back to that box, even if you remain a Christian with more or less the same ideas you started with, you'll have a richer understanding of what you believe and overall be better off having taken the journey. Good luck. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, The Crowd Pleaser, A Little Logic, Daniel Bostet, Nademos, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.